You know that moment when you realize your entire life has been a lie? When everything you believed about yourself crumbles in a matter of seconds? I lived through that. In front of 15 millionaire investors, and what happened next changed not only my life, but the lives of everyone who was in that room. My name doesn't matter now. What matters is that exactly 7 months ago, I was considered the most useless employee at one of the country's largest tech companies. And today I need to tell this story before it's too late. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine waking up every day knowing you're invisible. Not literally invisible, but socially, professionally, existentially invisible. For 3 years, I was that woman. The employee everyone tolerated, but nobody really saw. I worked in the data analysis department at Tech Vision Corp. A fictional name, obviously, because what I'm about to reveal could destroy reputations. My desk was in the darkest corner of the office, between a broken water cooler and a printer that had been making strange noises since 2019. Pure symbolism, don't you think? My colleagues greeted me with that forced smile we reserve for people we know won't go far. My boss, Richard Matthews, treated me like furniture. Useful when necessary, ignored the rest of the time. I was the woman who made the spreadsheets nobody read, the reports nobody opened, the analyses nobody considered. But there was something they didn't know about me. Something I was discovering gradually, during the silent early morning hours when everyone had already gone home. I had a different capacity, a way of seeing patterns where others saw only random numbers. It was as if I could hear the hidden music in data, decipher the secret stories that numbers whispered. For months, I developed my own algorithm. It wasn't anything official, just a personal project born from my insomnia and desperate need to prove my worth. I called it Sigma Predictor, a system capable of anticipating market trends with frightening precision. I tested it in simulations, refined it in secret, perfected it like an artist working on her masterpiece in the basement. But I was just the invisible employee. Who would listen to my discoveries? The invitation arrived on a rainy Thursday in March. A cold, direct corporate email. Dinner with investors. Friday, 7 p.m., Le Bernardin Restaurant. Mandatory attendance for entire analysis team. My stomach contracted. I hated these events. I always felt like an imposter wearing a borrowed dress, trying to decipher inside jokes and conversations about investments that seemed written in code. But mandatory attendance left no room for interpretation. Le Bernardin was the kind of place where a dish cost more than my weekly salary. Crystal chandeliers, waiters who looked like diplomats, and a reverent silence that made every word echo like judgment. We arrived at exactly 7 p.m., myself, Richard, and 4 more colleagues from the department. The investors were already there. 15 men and women who controlled more money than I could count in a lifetime. Their faces were perfect masks of confidence and power, but their eyes evaluated everything. Every movement, every word, every breath. Richard transformed that night. The man who barely greeted me at the office now radiated charisma and authority. He commanded the table like a conductor leading a symphony of millions. He spoke about future projects, international expansions, investment returns that would make anyone salivate. I remained silent, as always, observing, analyzing, perceiving patterns in conversations, expressions, power dynamics that unfolded before me like an invisible chess game. It was then that Richard said something that made my blood freeze. We're restructuring our analysis team. Let's say some elements don't add the value we expected. The silence that followed was dense as molten lead. Everyone at the table knew exactly who Richard was talking about. I felt 15 pairs of eyes turned toward me, not directly, but with that cruel peripheral awareness that makes you feel naked in public. Actually, Richard continued, his voice taking on an almost pedagogical tone, we have a perfect example here with us tonight. My heart began beating so hard I feared everyone could hear it. Richard turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This is our junior analyst. 3 years with the company, and I can say with absolute certainty that she's the most, how can I put this delicately, unproductive employee we've ever had the displeasure of hiring. The words hit like physical punches. I felt the air escape from my lungs, the floor moving beneath my feet. The investors now observed me with a mixture of pity and discomfort, as if they were watching a traffic accident in slow motion. 3 years, Richard repeated, savoring each syllable. And what was your greatest contribution to the company? Any relevant project? Any analysis that impacted our strategic decisions? I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. It was as if my voice had been stolen by an evil spell. The seconds stretched like hours, each beat of my heart echoing in my head like war drums. Exactly, Richard concluded. Total silence. 'Cause there's nothing to say. Some employees are born for mediocrity and others can't even achieve that. One of the investors, a woman with gray hair and penetrating eyes, leaned slightly forward. Richard, is this really necessary? It is, Dr. Sarah Wilson. Our investors deserve total transparency about how we manage human resources. We can't allow unproductive elements to contaminate our culture of excellence. In that moment, something died inside me. It wasn't just my pride or self-esteem, it was something deeper. The version of myself that still believed I could be accepted, valued, respected. That version simply disappeared, but in its place something new began to be born. Something cold, calculating, and absolutely determined. The dinner continued for 2 more torturous hours. Richard presented financial projections, discussed market strategies, and painted a golden future for TechVision Corp. I remained there, a ghost at the table, absorbing every word, every number, every grandiose promise. But my mind was no longer focused on the humiliation. It was processing data, analyzing the information Richard shared so generously, cross-referencing it with everything I knew about the market patterns I had identified. And that's when I realized something disturbing. Richard's projections were wrong. Not just slightly inaccurate, completely, catastrophically wrong. The numbers he presented with such confidence ignored obvious trends, dismissed glaring warning signs, and were based on premises my algorithm had identified as flawed months ago. TechVision Corp was walking toward financial disaster, and Richard was selling this disaster as a golden opportunity to investors who trusted him. When dinner finally ended, the investors said goodbye with firm handshakes and promises of very productive conversations in the coming days. Richard radiated satisfaction, clearly convinced he had sealed million-dollar deals. In the parking lot, he approached me for the first time that night. I hope you learned something today, he said, adjusting his expensive tie, about your place in this company, about what happens to people who don't add value. I stared at him in silence. For a moment, I saw a shadow of uncertainty pass through his eyes, as if he had noticed something different in me, something that wasn't there before. Monday. I want your desk cleared, he continued. Human resources will process your termination. Consider it a favor. I'm sparing you the shame of being fired publicly. He walked away, leaving me alone under the yellow parking lot light. But I wasn't really alone. I was accompanied by crystal clear clarity, a determination I had never felt before. Richard had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated me. I returned home that night transformed. My small, messy apartment, which had always seemed like a symbol of my mediocrity, now felt like a secret laboratory. I turned on my personal computer and opened the Sigma predictor files. Throughout the entire night, I worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I took all the information Richard had shared at dinner, the investment sectors, timelines, financial projections, and fed them into my algorithm. The result was devastating. My system predicted a 40% drop in TechVision Corp's stock value within 6 months. The sectors Richard planned to expand were on the verge of recession. The products he promised to launch would face fierce competition from companies already years ahead in development. More than that, the algorithm identified an opportunity, a very specific time window where a completely different strategy could not only save the company but multiply its value by 5. I had information worth millions in my hands, maybe billions. The question was what to do with it. During the weekend, an idea began forming in my mind. It was audacious to the point of madness, but also brilliant in its simplicity. If Richard wanted to discard me as a useless employee, I would prove exactly the opposite, but not in the way he expected. Monday arrived like a silent storm. I arrived at the office earlier than ever, but not to clean my desk. I had a different mission. I accessed my corporate computer and began preparing a document. It wasn't a common report. It was a complete, detailed, and absolutely irrefutable presentation about TechVision Corp's financial future. It included graphs, projections, risk analyses, and most importantly, an alternative strategy that could transform the company into the market's dominant player. At 9 a.m., Richard arrived at the office with his usual smile of superiority. He waved at me with that condescending gesture I had learned to hate. "Still here?" he asked, feigning surprise. "I thought it was clear on Friday." "It was," I replied, my voice surprisingly calm. "But before I go, I need to show you something." He laughed, a short, disdainful laugh. "Seriously, now you want to impress? 3 years too late, don't you think? Maybe. But 5 minutes of your time could be worth several $1,000,000. Something in my tone made Richard pause. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. 5 minutes, he said finally. "After that, I want you out of my building." The meeting room had never seemed so small to me. Richard sat across the table, arms crossed, an expression of poorly disguised boredom on his face. He was clearly doing this just to amuse himself, one last humiliation before expelling me definitively. I turned on the projector, and the first slide appeared on the wall. It was simple. Predictive analysis, the real future of TechVision Corp. For the past 3 years, I began, my voice gaining strength with each word. You saw me as a useless employee. And maybe you were right, for the functions I was assigned. But during that time, I was developing something you never imagined I was capable of. Richard rolled his eyes but didn't interrupt me. The second slide showed the Sigma predictor algorithm, not the technical details, but its results, graphs showing market predictions with 94% accuracy over the past 2 years. This system, I continued, analyzed more than 50,000 data points from the tech market, and it has a very clear message about the plans you presented to investors on Friday. The third slide was like a bomb. It showed Richard's projections side by side with my algorithm's predictions. The discrepancy was shocking. Richard leaned forward, his expression of boredom replaced by something very different. Concentration, concern, maybe even fear. "This is impossible," he murmured. "It's factual," I corrected. "Your expansion plans will lead the company to bankruptcy in 18 months. The sectors you want to invest in are on the verge of collapse. The products you promised to develop are already obsolete before even leaving the drawing board." I showed slide after slide, each revealing another aspect of the imminent catastrophe. Richard became increasingly pale, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned forward to examine the data more closely. "But," I said, reaching the final slide, "there is an alternative." The last part of the presentation was my masterpiece. A complete strategy that would not only save TechVision Corp, but transform it into the tech giant Richard had always dreamed of commanding. It was bold, innovative, and most importantly, completely viable according to all Sigma predictor analyses. This is genius," Richard whispered, his voice laden with reluctant admiration. "It's 3 years of work," I replied. 3 years you considered completely useless." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculations happening in his mind. Pride fighting against greed, the humiliation of being wrong competing with the prospect of extraordinary profits. "What do you want?" he asked finally. It was the question I had been waiting for, the question I had prepared for throughout the entire night. "I want you to give me an opportunity," I said. "A real presentation to the investors, not as the useless employee you humiliated on Friday, but as the analyst who developed the strategy that can multiply the company's value by 5. Richard laughed, but it was a nervous laugh without humor. "You're crazy. After what happened on Friday, how can I—" "You can," I interrupted, "because you have no choice. Your investors will discover the truth anyway. The question is, will they discover it when it's too late to do something about it? Or will they discover it in time to turn this into the biggest investment opportunity of their lives?" The silence that followed was charged with tension. I could see Richard weighing his options, calculating risks, measuring his pride against his ambition. "If I do this," he said slowly, "and you make me look foolish—" "If I make you look foolish," I replied, "you can fire me on the spot and never think about me again. But if I'm right, and I am, You'll owe me more than you can imagine." Richard took 2 days to make his decision. 2 days during which I remained in limbo, officially fired but still with office access, while he discreetly verified some of my predictions with his own analysts. Thursday morning, he appeared at my desk with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't exactly respect, but it definitely wasn't contempt anymore. "The investors will be here tomorrow at 2 p.m., he said without preamble. "You have 1 hour to present your analysis. 1 hour to prove you're not the useless employee I thought you were. And if I prove it, he paused, clearly struggling with the words, we'll renegotiate your position in the company." Friday arrived like a hurricane of nervousness and adrenaline. I spent the entire morning refining my presentation, checking every number, every graph, every conclusion. There could be no margin for error. At exactly 2 p.m., I entered the main meeting room. The same 15 investors from the week before were there, but the atmosphere was completely different. There was tension in the air, expectation. Richard had clearly prepared the ground, mentioning there was significant new information about the company's plans. When they saw me enter, some investors exchanged confused looks. It was obvious they remembered me, the useless employee who had been publicly humiliated just a week before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his voice slightly tense, "I'd like to present an alternative analysis of our expansion plans, an analysis that, well, that might completely change our perspective on TechVision Corp's future." I had never spoken to such an important audience. 15 people who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars watched me with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Some clearly remembered last week's humiliation and seemed to be wondering if this was some kind of cruel joke. But when I began to speak, something magical happened. All the hours of preparation, all the months of algorithm development, all the years of silent observation crystallized into a presentation that was simultaneously devastating and inspiring. I showed how the original projections were fundamentally flawed, not arrogantly or vindictively, but with the surgical precision of someone who had dedicated her life to understanding data patterns. Each slide revealed another aspect of the reality everyone had ignored. The room became progressively quieter, not the uncomfortable silence of humiliation, but the reverent silence of people realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. When I reached the alternative strategy part, the energy in the room changed completely. I saw eyes lighting up, bodies leaning forward, pens being raised to take notes. Dr. Wilson, the investor who had questioned my humiliation the week before, watched me with an intensity that bordered on fascination. "The projections you saw last week," I said, reaching the presentation's climax, "promised returns of 15% per year. The strategy I'm proposing, based on real predictive analysis and verifiable market trends, can generate returns of 300% in 3 years. A murmur of excitement ran through the room. 300% wasn't just a good investment. It was the kind of opportunity that defines entire careers. What followed was an hour of technical questions, intellectual challenges, and intense scrutiny. Each investor tried to find flaws in my analysis, holes in my logic, inconsistencies in my data. It was like being in a courtroom where 15 prosecutors tried to dismantle my case, but I was prepared. 3 years of silent work, constant refinement, testing and retesting had given me unshakable confidence in my numbers. Every question was answered with precision. Every challenge was met with irrefutable data. Dr. James Martinez, one of the country's most respected investors, leaned back in his chair and studied me with calculating eyes. "Young woman," he said finally, "if your numbers are correct, and our preliminary analysis suggests they are, you haven't just identified an extraordinary opportunity. You saved all of us from financial disaster." Dr. Wilson nodded. "The question now is, why wasn't this analysis presented before? Why did we only learn about this after almost making $1 million mistake?" The silence in the room became heavy. All eyes turned to Richard, who had visibly paled. It was the moment I had anticipated, the moment when the truth about my position in the company would inevitably be revealed. "Well," Richard began, clearly uncomfortable. "There were some internal communication issues, Dr. Patricia Santos, another investor, interrupted. Or talent recognition issues? The tension in the room was palpable. I could see Richard struggling to find an explanation that wouldn't make him look completely incompetent as a manager. It was then that I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. "Gentlemen and ladies," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "I can explain exactly what happened." Richard looked at me with a mixture of panic and pleading. He clearly expected me to destroy him publicly, to reveal how I had been treated, to expose his incompetence before the most important investors of his career. But I had a different plan. "During the past 3 years," I continued, "I worked on a completely independent predictive analysis project. It wasn't a company initiative. It was a personal project, developed in my free time, using my own resources." Strategic pause. Everyone in the room hung on every word. The reason this analysis wasn't presented before is simple. It wasn't ready. Predictive algorithms require years of data to be reliable. Only now, with 3 years of development and testing, can I present results with 94% accuracy. Another silence, but this time charged with understanding instead of tension. "What I'm proposing now," I said, looking directly at each investor, "is a partnership. Not just to implement this specific strategy, but to establish a predictive analysis department that can revolutionize how TechVision Corp makes investment decisions." Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "You're talking about institutionalizing your methodology?" "Exactly. Transforming what was a personal project into a permanent competitive advantage for the company." Dr. Wilson smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her. "This is ambitious and intelligent." Richard watched me with an expression I couldn't decipher. There was relief there, relief that I hadn't exposed him publicly. But there was also something deeper. Reluctant respect, perhaps, or recognition that he had completely underestimated who I really was. What followed were 2 hours of intense negotiation. The investors wanted details about implementation, timelines, costs, organizational structure. They wanted to understand not just what I had discovered, but how this could be transformed into a sustainable competitive advantage. I was prepared for everything. I had spent months anticipating exactly these questions, developing not just the analysis, but a complete implementation plan. "I propose creating a predictive intelligence department," I explained. "A small but specialized team, focused on long-term trend analysis and identifying opportunities that traditional methods can't detect." "And you would lead this department?" asked Dr. Santos. "If the investors and company management agree, yes." Richard finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "This would represent a significant change in the company's organizational structure." "It would," I agreed. "But the potential returns justify the restructuring." Dr. Wilson exchanged glances with the other investors. I could see silent communication happening, the kind of nonverbal dialogue that powerful people develop after years working together. "We need a few minutes to discuss this privately," she said finally. Richard and I left the room, leaving the 15 investors alone to deliberate on a proposal that could change not just my life, but the entire future of TechVision Corp. In the hallway, Richard turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. It was no longer the familiar contempt or habitual condescension. It was something close to admiration. "How?" he asked simply. "How what? How did you do this? How did you go from what you were, to this?" It was a fair question. A week before, I was the employee he considered completely useless. Now I was negotiating with some of the country's most powerful investors. "You want the honest answer?" I asked. He nodded. "You underestimated me. Completely. For 3 years you assumed that because I was quiet I was incompetent. Because I didn't promote myself I had no value. Because I didn't play office politics I had no ambition. But while you were focused on impressing people, I was focused on understanding patterns. While you were building relationships, I was building algorithms. While you were selling promises, I was creating solutions." Richard remained silent for a long moment. "And last week's humiliation?" he asked finally. I smiled, not with bitterness, but with genuine satisfaction. It was the catalyst I needed. Sometimes we need to hit rock bottom to discover what we're really capable of. 20 minutes later, We were called back to the room. The atmosphere had changed again. There was an energy of decision in the air, the kind of tension that precedes important announcements. Dr. Martinez assumed the role of group spokesperson. After extensive discussion, he began. We've reached some conclusions. First, your analysis is not only correct, but extraordinarily valuable. Second, implementing a predictive analysis department is not just desirable, but essential for the company's competitive future. My heart began to accelerate. Third, he continued, we're willing to invest not just in the strategy you presented, but in the infrastructure necessary to make this capability a permanent advantage for TechVision Corp. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. But we have conditions. Of course they had conditions. Investors always have conditions. First condition. You'll have total autonomy over the predictive analysis department, reporting directly to the investor board, not to the company's traditional management. I looked at Richard, who had become visibly tense. This meant I would no longer be subordinate to him. I would be, effectively, his equal in the corporate hierarchy. Second condition, we want a 5-year exclusivity contract. Your methodology, your algorithms, your discoveries belong entirely to TechVision Corp during this period. And the third condition? I asked. Dr. Santos smiled. The third condition is that you accept equity participation in the company. 5% of shares, with voting rights on strategic decisions. The silence in the room was absolute. 5% of a company valued at hundreds of millions meant I was being offered a personal fortune that exceeded my most ambitious dreams. We need an answer now, said Dr. Wilson. This offer is only valid until the end of this meeting. I looked around the room. 15 faces watched me with expectation. Richard stared at me with an indecipherable expression. Part shock, part reluctant respect, part something that could be envy. A week before, I was the company's most despised employee. Now I was being offered not just a leadership position, but equity participation that would make me one of TechVision Corp's owners. I accept, I said, my voice surprisingly firm. The room exploded into activity. Handshakes, congratulations, discussions about implementation timelines and contractual structures. In a matter of minutes, my life had changed so radically that I could barely process the reality. Dr. Martinez pulled me aside while the others discussed legal details. Can I ask a personal question? He said. Sure. How do you feel? A week ago, you were publicly humiliated. Today, you're one of the company's owners. This must be surreal. I thought about the question for a moment. How did I feel? You know, I said finally. For 3 years, I convinced myself I was invisible because I wasn't good enough to be seen. But the truth is I was invisible because I was building something no one else could see. And now I understand that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. While everyone is looking at the obvious candidates for success, you can work in silence, build something extraordinary, and emerge when they least expect it. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. Wisdom beyond your years. Today, as I write this story, it's been exactly 7 months since that fateful dinner at Le Bernardin. The predictive intelligence department I created employs 15 specialized analysts and is considered the strategic heart of TechVision Corp. My algorithms' predictions proved not just correct, but conservative. The company not only avoided the financial disaster I had predicted, but implemented the alternative strategy with results that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Our market value increased 280% in the last 6 months. My equity participation, which seemed like an impossible dream a few months ago, is now worth more than $50 million. But money isn't the most important part of this story. Richard still works at the company, but our relationship has changed completely. He never explicitly apologized for that night's humiliation, but his actions speak louder than words. He treats me with genuine respect, and occasionally even asks my opinion on important strategic decisions. More significantly, he never again underestimated an employee based solely on first impressions. Dr. Wilson became an informal mentor, teaching me about the world of high-level investments. Dr. Martinez invited me to join 2 other advisory boards. Dr. Santos is financing my next project, an even more ambitious algorithm that can revolutionize not just market analysis, but prediction of social and political trends. If you've made it this far in this story, you're probably wondering, what's the real lesson? What can I learn from this experience? The answer is simpler and more complex than you imagine. For years, I accepted the narrative others created about me. I was the mediocre employee, the worthless analyst, the invisible woman in the corner of the room. I internalized this identity until it became my reality. But identities are just stories we tell about ourselves, and stories can be rewritten. What changed that night wasn't just my position in the company or my financial situation. What changed was my fundamental understanding of who I really was and what I was capable of. I discovered I had confused silence with weakness, humility with incompetence, patience with passivity. In reality, these characteristics weren't limitations. They were powerful tools I simply didn't know how to use. There's a secret that few understand about real power, about lasting success, about genuine transformation. It's not about being the tallest, the fastest, the loudest. It's about being the most prepared when opportunity finally comes. For 3 years, while others played office politics and promoted themselves, I was building something real. Something solid. Something no one could take from me because it was based on genuine competence, not perception or relationships. When my moment came, and it came dramatically and unexpectedly, I was ready. Not just ready, but over-prepared. Now let me ask you a question. You who have listened to this story to the end. What story are you telling about yourself? What identity have you accepted as immutable truth? What limitations have you internalized as permanent characteristics of your personality? And more importantly, what are you building in silence, away from others' eyes, that could one day completely transform how the world sees you? Because here's the truth, it took me 3 years to learn. We all have a predictive algorithm inside us. A unique capacity to see patterns others don't see, to understand connections others don't make, to create solutions others can't imagine. The question isn't whether you have this power. The question is whether you'll develop it in silence until you're ready to surprise the world. This story ends here, but actually, it's just the beginning. The beginning of a new understanding about what it means to be underestimated, about the hidden power of silent preparation, about the transformative force of never giving up on yourself, even when everyone else has already given up. If you identified with any part of this narrative, if you recognize something of yourself in the invisible employee I was, then let this story be the catalyst it was for me that humiliating night at Le Bernardin. Don't wait for a dinner with investors. Don't wait for public humiliation. Don't wait for others to recognize your value before you recognize it yourself. Start today. Start now. Start building your own predictive algorithm, your own secret advantage, your own silent transformation. Because somewhere, at some future moment, your opportunity will come. And when it comes, you want to be ready not just to seize it, but to exceed it so spectacularly that everyone who underestimated you will wonder how they could have been so blind. The final question is, will you be ready?